Alright, let's go. Number 10, the Panthalassa Ocean. It was a single body of water so large that it had its own weather systems, its own current loops, and its own extinction events, and most people have never heard its name. The Permian period, 252 million years ago. Before the Atlantic existed, before the Indian Ocean filled its basin, before the Pacific took its current shape, there was one ocean. Geologists call it Panthalassa, from the Greek for all sea, and the name is not an exaggeration. It covered approximately 70% of the planet's surface, a continuous body of saltwater that stretched from pole to pole with no continent to interrupt it. The landmass it surrounded, Pangaea, sat like a single bruise on one side of a blue sphere. The ocean on the other side had no name because there was nothing on the other side to name it from. Paleoclimatologists studying drill cores from the Pacific Basin in the early 2000s, working out of institutions including the Geological Survey of Japan, began to reconstruct what this ocean actually did to the planet's climate, and the reconstruction was not what they expected. What they found in those cores was a record of temperature stratification unlike anything in any living ocean. Dr. Yukio Isazaki, a stratigrapher at the University of Tokyo, identified a pattern in Permian-era deep-sea chert deposits suggesting that Panthalassa's abyssal zones, the lightless depths below 2,000 meters, had periodically gone anoxic. Not partially oxygen-depleted, the way some modern dead zones go, fully anoxic. The water at depth stopped carrying dissolved oxygen entirely. The boundary between the oxygenated surface water and the anoxic deep was sharp enough, in geological terms, that it could be read in centimeter-thick layers of stone. The conventional explanation for this was a disruption of thermohaline circulation, the global conveyor belt of cold, dense, sinking water that oxygenates the deep sea. But the disruption Isazaki's team was reading in the rock record was not a brief stalling. It lasted, by their estimate, several million years. The event entered scientific literature quietly. The papers were technical, published in journals with small circulation outside academic geology, and the popular science press mostly missed the implications. What most people received, if they received anything at all, was a simplified version. The Permian-Triassic extinction killed 96% of marine species. The ocean was involved. End of story. The version that did not reach most people was the version that asked what a planet-sized ocean looks like when its deep layers stop breathing, and what that means for everything living in the layers above. The Panthalassa anoxia event was officially framed as a contributing factor to the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, one cause among several, subsumed into a broader narrative dominated by the Siberian Traps volcanism. The framing was not inaccurate. It was, however, incomplete in ways that oceanographers continued to note in subsequent decades, in papers that did not generate press releases. But the detail that the conventional framing does not fully resolve is this: Panthalassa did not just host the extinction, it drove it. The anoxic water that pooled in the deep did not stay in the deep. When circulation eventually resumed, when the density gradients that had kept it stratified finally broke down, that water upwelled. It reached the surface. It carried with it hydrogen sulfide, a gas produced by anaerobic bacteria, in concentrations that, when released into the atmosphere, would have been lethal to lungs. Researchers at Penn State, led by Dr. Lee Kump, published a model in 2005 suggesting that this upwelling may have poisoned coastal air across millions of square kilometers. Panthalassa was not merely the site of the extinction. By the most conservative estimates, it was an ocean that periodically exhaled death, and it covered 7/10 of the Earth for over 200 million years. Number 9, the Tethys Ocean. It opened and closed twice, and the second time it closed, it built a mountain range that still exists, but the ocean itself has left almost no trace in the memory of modern science. 600 million years ago, during the late Neoproterozoic, a rift opened in what would eventually become the North Atlantic. The supercontinent Rodinia was breaking apart. As the continental plates pulled away from each other, seawater flooded the gap, slowly at first, then catastrophically, the way water always fills a basin once the lip gives way. What formed was the Tethys Ocean, named by geologist W. Brian Harland in 1964 after the titan who fathered Atlas, because it sat where the Atlantic would eventually be, and naming it after the father of the Atlantic seemed appropriate. Harland was working from paleomagnetic data, tracing the ancient positions of continents by reading the magnetic signatures locked into basalt when it cooled. His conclusion that a substantial ocean had opened and then entirely closed before the Atlantic formed was not immediately accepted. It required the acceptance of plate tectonics itself, which was still contested in 1964. The evidence for Tethys came largely from the fossils on either side of it. Dr. John Tuzo Wilson, a Canadian geophysicist at the University of Toronto, observed in 1966 that the Appalachian Mountains of eastern North America and the Caledonian Mountains of Scotland and Norway contained virtually identical Cambrian-era trilobite species, but only on specific sides of those mountain belts. The species matched because they had once lived on the same coastline. The mountains themselves were the compressed, crumpled remains of the ocean floor and continental margins that had collided when Iapetus closed. Wilson walked through this logic in a paper that was, by geological standards, almost narrative. He described the ocean opening, filling, closing, and leaving only the mountains as evidence. The paper was largely responsible for the concept now called a Wilson cycle. What most people know, if they know anything about the Appalachians, is that they are old mountains. What most people do not know is that they are the tombstone of an ocean. The popular account of mountain formation rarely includes the destruction of oceanic basins. The ocean that was consumed beneath those mountains, subducted, melted, recycled into the mantle, left almost nothing on the surface. A few fragments of ancient seafloor, called ophiolites, are preserved in places like Newfoundland's Gros Morne National Park. They are unremarkable-looking slabs of dark rock that visitors walk past without recognition. The Tethys Ocean was formally accepted into the geological canon in the 1970s as plate tectonic theory became consensus. Its existence was confirmed through paleomagnetic studies, fossil distribution analysis, and the identification of ophiolite sequences along the Appalachian Caledonian Belt. The process of confirmation was gradual and undramatic, spread across dozens of papers in journals like the Geological Society of America Bulletin, and it generated no public milestone. And yet the detail that standard accounts of Iapetus do not fully reckon with is its fauna. The Tethys Ocean was opened during the Cambrian explosion, the 50-million-year window in which most of the major animal body plans on Earth appear in the fossil record simultaneously, with no clear antecedents. The organisms that evolved in Iapetus included animals we have no descendants for. Anomalocaris, a predator the length of a man's arm with compound eyes and circular, rasping mouthparts, patrolled its shallows. Hallucigenia, a creature so structurally alien that paleontologists initially drew it upside down and mistook its legs for spines, lived on its seafloor. The Tethys Ocean was not just a body of water that no longer exists. It was the habitat of the most concentrated burst of evolutionary invention in the history of life, and then it closed and took most of that experiment with it. The Caledonian Mountains, now worn to gentle Scottish hills, are all that remain of it above the surface of the Earth. Number 8. The Tethys Sea. It was warm, shallow, and productive enough to store almost half of the world's current petroleum reserves, and it died slowly enough that animals watched it go. Approximately 250 million years ago, between the northern landmass of Laurasia and the southern landmass of Gondwana, a body of water formed that geologists call the Tethys Sea. It was not deep. By the standards of ocean science, it was almost embarrassingly shallow, a warm carbonate-rich epicontinental sea that at its maximum extent stretched from what is now Gibraltar to what is now Indonesia. The water temperature in its shallower reaches, according to oxygen isotope data from carbonate sediments, was consistently higher than any living tropical ocean. Ammonites, coiled cephalopods with chambered shells, diversified here into hundreds of species. Rudists, bivalves shaped like ice cream cones that built reef structures rivaling modern coral, colonized its margins. The seafloor beneath the Tethys accumulated organic material at a rate that, over millions of years, became the petroleum deposits beneath Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and the broader Middle East. Geologists at the French Petroleum Institute, working in the 1970s and 1980s, traced the source rock of those reservoirs back to Tethyan sediments laid down during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Dr. Nairn Saville of the University of Strasbourg, who spent much of his career mapping Tethyan paleogeography, described the sea in a 1978 monograph as a global thermal engine, a body of water warm enough and connected enough to the world ocean that its circulation patterns influenced climate across both hemispheres. The evaporation rate in its most restricted phases was high enough that hypersaline waters formed along its margins, dense brines that sank and flowed westward along the seafloor like slow rivers of salt. The record of these brines is preserved in evaporate deposits, thick beds of gypsum, and halite that crop out across North Africa, Spain, and Central Asia. A geologist who walks into salt mining Cardona, Catalonia, is walking through the remains of a Tethyan evaporation event. The closing of the Tethys entered public awareness almost entirely through the backdoor of petroleum geology. The connection between a vanished sea and a full gas tank was occasionally made in popular science writing, but the emphasis was always on the oil, not on the ocean. The Tethys as a living ecosystem, as a place where animals actually moved, fed, and died, received almost no popular attention. What most people received was the statistic, not the sea. The Tethys Sea was formally reclassified into two successor bodies, the Western Tethys, which became the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Tethys, which was consumed by the collision of India with Asia over the course of the Cenozoic era, roughly 65 to 5 million years ago. The closure was documented through a combination of plate tectonic modeling and sedimentary basin analysis. The scientific literature treated it as a tectonic event. The biological consequences received less systematic attention. But the detail that the tectonic framing does not resolve is this: the Tethys did not close at once, it retreated. Over tens of millions of years, its margins dried, its shallows evaporated, and its fauna, which had diversified for nearly 200 million years in stable, warm, productive water, was forced to either adapt or contract into the shrinking remnant that would become the Mediterranean. The Ammonites did not make it. The Rudists did not make it. The lineages that had been the ecological backbone of the Tethys for the entire Mesozoic era were gone by the time the Paleocene began. The sea they had evolved and outlasted them by millions of years. A warm, productive, increasingly isolated body of water that still had animals in it, but not the animals it had made. The Mediterranean Sea, which 4 million people currently live along the shore of, is what remains when you remove everything that made the Tethys what it was. If you're finding this as unsettling as we intended, subscribe now. There are 7 more of these and they only get stranger. Number 7, the Devonian Ocean. For 60 million years, it was home to the largest animals that had ever lived, and then, in geological terms, it ended almost overnight. The Devonian period ran from approximately 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago. The ocean that covered most of the planet during this time was warm, oxygenated, and stacked with life in a way that had not been seen before. The first coral reefs, true colonial reef structures, appeared in the Devonian. Crinoids covered the seafloor in meadows that, based on density estimates from limestone deposits in Ohio and Indiana, extended for hundreds of kilometers without interruption. And in the open water above these reefs, for the first time in Earth history, there were fish with jaws. Placoderms, armored fish with bony head shields and crushing jaws made of interlocking plates, grew to sizes that no vertebrate before them had ever reached. Dunkleosteus terrelli, a placoderm identified from fossil material collected in the Cleveland Shale of northern Ohio, is estimated to have reached 9 meters in length. Its jaws, reconstructed from fossil bone by Dr. Philip Anderson at the University of Chicago, could close with a force comparable to a large crocodile. It did not have teeth, it bit with the edges of its own skull. Dr. Michael Benton, a paleontologist at the University of Bristol, has described the late Devonian extinction event as one of the 5 great mass extinctions in the history of life, one that eliminated approximately 75% of all species over a period that, by some estimates, lasted as little as 100,000 years and by others stretched across 2 million. The mechanism is still debated. Leading hypotheses include the spread of land plants, whose roots broke up soil and flushed nutrients into shallow coastal seas, triggering algal blooms that consumed dissolved oxygen. Other researchers point to episodes of rapid global cooling, or bolide impacts. What the rock record shows is that the warm, shallow, reef-dominated Devonian Ocean abruptly gave way to seafloor covered in dark, fine-grained sediment, the signature of anoxic water, of a sea that had stopped breathing near the bottom. What entered public knowledge about the Devonian was primarily the fish. Popular science writing about the period focused on Dunkleosteus, on the first lobe-finned fish that crawled onto land, on the evolutionary narrative of vertebrates leaving water. The extinction received less attention than the transition. The version most people internalized was one of progression, the Devonian as the chapter where fish grew legs, rather than catastrophe. The late Devonian extinction was formally categorized in the geological literature through the 1980s and 1990s as a multi-phase event, sometimes referred to as the Kellwasser and Hangenberg events after the specific stratigraphic horizons in which mass die-offs are recorded. The classification was accepted without controversy. The lack of a single clear cause was noted in the literature but did not generate the same public engagement as, for example, the asteroid impact hypothesis for the Cretaceous extinction. And yet the detail that no single causal hypothesis has resolved is the reefs. The Devonian reef systems, which had taken 60 million years to develop and had spread across continental shelves on every major landmass, did not recover after the extinction. Coral reef ecosystems of comparable scale did not reappear in the fossil record for approximately 15 million years. That is not a gap. That is an absence long enough that, if it happened today, it would begin with the death of every coral reef on Earth and end at a point in time that no human civilization can meaningfully imagine. The Devonian Ocean built the most complex shallow water ecosystem Earth had yet produced, and then the ocean itself removed it, and the Earth stayed empty in that particular way for longer than our entire genus has existed. Number 6, the Cretaceous Interior Seaway. It split North America in half for nearly 50 million years, and the animals that lived in it have no living analogues anywhere on Earth today. 100 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous period, a shallow seaway flooded through the center of North America, connecting the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico along a continuous corridor that ran roughly through the middle of the modern United States and Canada. Geologists call it the Western Interior Seaway, and at its maximum extent it was roughly 900 kilometers wide and 800 meters deep at its center. Not deep by oceanic standards, but deep enough, warm enough, and productive enough to sustain a predator fauna that had no equivalent before or since. The sea surface temperature in its shallower reaches, inferred from isotopic analysis of fossil oyster shells by researchers at the University of Michigan, was comparable to a modern tropical lagoon, but it sat at the latitude of modern Montana and Kansas. It was a tropical sea in a temperate location, maintained by a global greenhouse climate that had no polar ice. Dr. Kenneth Carpenter of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science spent years studying the mosasaurs, marine lizards, related to modern monitor lizards, that had returned to the sea and become fully aquatic, that dominated the seaway's upper water column. The largest, Tylosaurus proriger, reached lengths of 12 meters. Carpenter's reconstructions showed that it moved through the water not like a fish but like a snake, lateral undulation of the entire body, and that it fed on anything it could fit in its jaws, including other mosasaurs. A specimen from Kansas, now housed at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History in Hays, Kansas, was found with the remains of a large fish, a marine bird, and a smaller mosasaur inside its body cavity. It had eaten 3 things before it died. None of the 3 things existed anywhere outside the seaway. The Cretaceous Interior Seaway entered public knowledge primarily through the fossil record of Kansas, which has produced some of the most complete marine reptile specimens in the world. The Smoky Hill chalk, a soft formation that erodes easily and exposes fossils at the surface, has been picked over by collectors since the 1860s, when Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh competed to extract and name its fauna. The popular account of the seaway's creatures focused on spectacle, on the size and predatory habit of its inhabitants, and less on the ecological structure of a sea that no longer exists on any continent. The Western Interior Seaway drained at the end of the Cretaceous period, approximately 66 million years ago, as the Rocky Mountains rose and the sea floor tilted. The drainage was not caused by the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous. It was already underway. The mass extinction at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary killed whatever remained in the seaway's final, shrunken form. The event was not treated in the scientific literature as the loss of a distinct ecosystem so much as a footnote to the larger extinction. But the detail that the tectonic explanation does not address is what happened to the animals that had specialized in it. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, the giant fish Xiphictinus, none of them had any refuge. The seaway was not a branch of any other ocean that they could retreat into. It was a self-contained system, occupying a geographic position that no other Cretaceous sea occupied, with water temperatures and chemistry that no other Cretaceous sea replicated. When it drained, everything that had adapted specifically to it died with it. There is no other example in the fossil record of a sea this large, this ecologically distinct, that closed this completely, leaving not even a remnant body of water where its specialist fauna might have persisted. The Great Plains of North America, where farmers now plant wheat, sit on the sediments of that vanished sea. The chalk under Kansas is made almost entirely of the bodies of the organisms that lived in it. Number 5. The Ediacaran Ocean. The animals that lived in it were so different from everything that came after that scientists spent decades arguing about whether they were animals at all. 635 million years ago, the Earth had just emerged from the most severe glaciation in its history, a period so cold that ice may have extended to the equator, a state that researchers at the California Institute of Technology led by Dr. Joseph Kirschvink named Snowball Earth in a 1992 paper. What came after was the Ediacaran period, named for the Ediacaran Hills of South Australia, where its fossils were first formally described. The ocean that covered most of the planet during this period was unlike anything before or after it. It was anoxic at depth. Oxygen had not yet accumulated in the deep sea in the concentrations that later life would require, but its surface waters were productive, warmed by a greenhouse effect triggered by the massive volcanic outgassing that had ended the glaciation. Into this strange, transitional, chemically unstable ocean, multicellular life exploded, not quickly by human standards. But in geological terms, the appearance of complex, macroscopic organisms in the Ediacaran fossil record is nearly instantaneous. Dr. Guy Narbonne of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, has spent much of his career describing Ediacaran fossils from the Mistaken Point Formation in Newfoundland, a site where the seafloor is covered with frond-like, quilt-like and disc-like impressions of organisms that lived in deep water, below the photic zone in complete darkness. Narbonne's work identified that these organisms, some of them more than a meter in length, had no mouths, no digestive tracts, no sensory organs of any kind that could be identified with certainty. They appear to have absorbed nutrients directly through their surfaces, the way a sponge absorbs water, but they were not sponges. They had a structure, a fractal branching pattern, a quilted texture that implied organization without being interpretable as any known animal or plant phylum. When he reached for comparison, Narbonne described them as an experiment in being alive that did not survive to the present. The Ediacaran fauna entered scientific awareness gradually, beginning with the work of Reginald Sprigg, an Australian geologist who found the first specimens in 1946 while surveying abandoned mines in South Australia. Sprigg initially thought they were Cambrian jellyfish. The scientific community mostly agreed. It took decades of additional work, by Martin Gleisner, by Adolf Seelescher, by Narbonne and others, to establish that the Ediacaran organisms were not just early versions of things that still exist, but a fundamentally different kind of life. The version most people received, if they received one at all, was that the Ediacaran was a preview of the Cambrian explosion. That framing is not accurate. The Ediacaran organisms were formally reclassified multiple times throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Seelescher, a paleontologist at the University of Tübingen, proposed in 1989 that they were not animals at all but a separate kingdom of life, what he called Vendobionta, that had been entirely wiped out by the Cambrian and left no descendants. His hypothesis was debated, qualified, partially accepted, and never fully resolved. The classification remains contested in the technical literature. And yet the detail that no classification fully resolves is the transition itself. The Ediacaran fauna disappears from the fossil record at the beginning of the Cambrian, approximately 539 million years ago, with a speed that is genuinely difficult to explain. What replaces them, the Cambrian fauna, with their shells, their eyes, their legs, their predatory behavior, is so structurally different that the two assemblages share almost no species. The leading hypothesis is that the invention of predation in the Cambrian killed the Ediacaran organisms, which had no defenses because nothing had ever attacked them before. Something in the Ediacaran Ocean learned to eat, and everything that had never needed to run or hide or build a shell was gone within a geological instant. The Ediacaran Ocean was the last time life existed on Earth without the concept of being eaten. It covered virtually the entire planet. It lasted nearly 100 million years. This would be a good time to subscribe, because what's coming in the top 4 is going to require your full attention. Number 4, the Ordovician Ocean. It was cold, deep, and covered 85% of the planet, and the extinction that ended it may have been caused by a star. 450 million years ago, during the Ordovician period, the world was almost entirely water. Gondwana, the southern supercontinent, sat over the South Pole and the ocean surrounding it, continuous, cold, and extraordinarily deep in places, covered more of the Earth's surface than any ocean before or since. The Ordovician was, by species count, a period of remarkable marine diversity. Crinoids, bryozoans, brachiopods, and nautiloid cephalopods, straight-shelled, some of them 3 meters long, occupied every depth zone. The bottom communities, reconstructed from limestone deposits in places like the Cincinnati Arch of the Midwestern United States, were so dense that paleontologists sometimes describe the Ordovician seafloor as a carpet, a continuous layer of filter-feeding organisms stacked on top of each other. Dr. Arnold Miller of the University of Cincinnati has described Ordovician marine diversity as the highest in Earth's history relative to the number of ecological niches available. The ocean was, by his reading of the fossil record, running at capacity. Then, at the end of the Ordovician, approximately 445 million years ago, a mass extinction killed approximately 85% of all marine species, the second largest extinction in the history of life. The conventional explanation involves the glaciation of Gondwana. As the southern ice sheet expanded, sea levels dropped, the shallow water habitats that most Ordovician life depended on were destroyed, and the temperature of the global ocean fell sharply. This explanation is accepted. But in 2004, Dr. Brian Thomas of Washburn University, working with a team of astrophysicists, published a paper in the Astrophysical Journal proposing an additional trigger: a gamma ray burst from a star within roughly 6,000 light-years of Earth. A burst of sufficient intensity, the paper argued, would have stripped away a significant portion of the ozone layer over the hemisphere facing the burst, exposing the sunlit ocean's surface to a level of ultraviolet radiation that would have killed photosynthetic plankton, the base of the marine food web, within weeks. The gamma ray burst hypothesis entered the scientific literature as a speculation, clearly framed as a possible contributing factor rather than a confirmed cause. It was covered by science journalists with appropriate qualification. The popular version that circulated, to the extent that it circulated at all, tended to strip the qualifications. The version most people received, if they received any, was a headline: "Did a space explosion cause the Ordovician extinction?" The answer, embedded in the peer-reviewed literature, was considerably more nuanced. The gamma-ray burst hypothesis has neither been confirmed nor definitively refuted as of the most recent literature. The glaciation hypothesis remains the primary accepted explanation for the Ordovician extinction. The two are not mutually exclusive. The published work on the topic notes the difficulty of finding preserved evidence in rock 445 million years old for an event that would have left no physical trace in the sedimentary record. But the detail that neither hypothesis fully addresses is this: the Ordovician Ocean recovered. After the extinction over the course of the Silurian period, marine life rediversified and rebuilt the ecological communities that had been destroyed. This recovery took approximately 25 million years, but the organisms that recovered were different organisms. The nautiloids that rebuilt their populations after the extinction were different species than the ones that had died. The brachiopods were different. The coral-like tabulate and rugose corals that came to dominate Silurian reefs had no direct ancestors in the Ordovician reef fauna. The Ordovician Ocean produced one version of complex marine life, sustained it for 70 million years, and then erased it. The Silurian Ocean produced a different version, starting almost from scratch, and almost no one who talks about either period talks about the scale of what was lost between them. Number 3. The Archean Ocean. It was green, iron-rich, and populated by organisms that are still alive today, and they are the reason any of us exist. 3.5 billion years ago, the Earth's ocean was not blue. It was green, possibly red in places. The water chemistry of the Archean Ocean was so different from any modern ocean that oceanographers and geochemists who study it essentially treat it as a different category of substance. There was no free oxygen in the water. Iron was dissolved in the seawater in concentrations that would be toxic to any modern marine organism. The temperature, based on oxygen isotope ratios from some of the oldest preserved marine sediments, charts from the Pilbara region of Western Australia and the Kopval Craton of South Africa, was somewhere between 50 and 70 degrees Celsius in some shallower zones, not boiling, but beyond the thermal tolerance of every complex organism alive today. And into this hot, iron-rich, oxygen-free ocean life arrived, not complex life, not animals, not anything with a nucleus. Bacteria, specifically cyanobacteria, appeared in the Archean Ocean and began doing something that no chemistry on Earth had done before. They photosynthesized. They took carbon dioxide from the water and sunlight from above and produced, as a metabolic byproduct, oxygen. Dr. J. William Skopf of UCLA spent decades studying the apex chert of Western Australia, a formation dating to approximately 3.45 billion years ago, and identified within it what he described as the oldest known fossilized cells on Earth, filamentous structures he interpreted as cyanobacteria. The claim was contested. Dr. Martin Brazier of the University of Oxford, examining the same specimens, argued in a 2002 paper in Nature that the structures were abiotic, formed by chemistry, not by life. The debate consumed years of technical argument and produced no consensus. Skopf defended his interpretation. Brazier defended his. Both continued to publish. Neither definitively won. What both sides agreed on was that by 3 billion years ago, photosynthetic life was present in the Archean Ocean, not because the apex chert settled it, but because by 3 billion years ago the chemical signature of photosynthesis is unambiguous in the rock record. What entered public knowledge about the Archean Ocean was essentially nothing. The period is too remote, its fossils too microscopic, its evidence too technical to generate popular narrative. The story that did circulate, that life began in the ocean, that the first organisms were simple, that oxygen was a waste product that changed the atmosphere, was told in textbooks as a sequence of facts, not as a story with actors, stakes, or consequences. The full version, in which bacteria in an ancient ocean spent over 1 billion years slowly poisoning their own atmosphere with a gas that was lethal to every organism alive at the time, received almost no narrative treatment. The Great Oxidation Event, the point, approximately 2.4 billion years ago, when free oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere in measurable quantities, was formally characterized in the geological literature in the latter half of the 20th century, through the work of researchers including Dr. Preston Cloud and later Dr. Heinrich Holland. It was framed as a planetary transition. Its biological dimension, that it represented the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, killing off the anaerobic organisms for which oxygen was toxic, was noted but not emphasized in the popular account. And yet the detail that the standard account does not fully sit with is the timescale. Cyanobacteria began producing oxygen in the Archean Ocean somewhere around 3 billion years ago. Free oxygen did not begin accumulating in the atmosphere until approximately 2.4 billion years ago. That is a gap of roughly 600 million years, longer than the entire span of complex animal life on Earth, during which oxygen was being produced and immediately consumed, scavenged by the dissolved iron in the seawater, oxidizing it and precipitating it to the seafloor as banded iron formations. The banded iron formations are now mined as iron ore. Every steel beam in every building in every city on Earth was once dissolved in the Archean Ocean waiting. The cyanobacteria that produced the oxygen that rusted it out of the water are still alive. They are in every ocean on Earth right now. They have not meaningfully changed in 3 billion years. They outlasted everything else on this list by a margin that is almost impossible to state without the number losing all meaning. Number 2, the Cryogenian Ocean. It may have frozen completely, and if it did, everything alive today descended from whatever survived in the gap between the ice and the rock. 717 million years ago, during a period geologists call the Cryogenian, the Earth's climate underwent a transition that remains, even now, the subject of genuine scientific controversy. The Sturtian glaciation, the first of two major glaciation events in the Cryogenian, appears in the rock record as a layer of glacial debris, called diamictite, found on every major continental landmass, including in formations that were based on paleomagnetic data located at the equator at the time of deposition. Glaciers at the equator. The implication that the entire Earth froze, that ice extended from the poles to the tropics and covered the ocean's surface entirely, is the Snowball Earth hypothesis, proposed formally by geologist Paul Hoffman of Harvard University and geochemist Daniel Schrag, also of Harvard, in a landmark 1998 paper in Science. Hoffman and Schrag did not invent the concept. Joseph Kirschvink had sketched its outlines in 1992, but they built the quantitative case, drawing on fieldwork in Namibia where the glacial deposits sat directly beneath cap carbonates, a layer of limestone that forms when carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere and then rapidly dissolves into the ocean when glaciation ends. Dr. Hoffman, who is described standing in the Namibian desert looking at the contact between the diamictite and the overlying carbonate as reading the end of the ice, spent years defending the hypothesis against alternative interpretations. Dr. Paul Allen of ETH Zurich, among others, proposed a slushball Earth model in which the tropical ocean remained partially ice-free, covered by a thin slushy layer rather than solid ice. The distinction matters enormously for survival. Under total ice cover, photosynthesis in the open ocean would have been impossible. Life would have been confined to hydrothermal vents and thin liquid refugia at the margins of the ice, places where geothermal heat prevented complete freezing, or where the ice was thin enough that some light penetrated. Under the slushball model, some surface photosynthesis continued, and the survival problem, while severe, was not existential. The Snowball Earth hypothesis entered public knowledge with unusual speed for a geological concept, in part because the 1998 Science paper was accompanied by a press release and in part because its implications were immediately legible to non-specialists. It was covered in newspapers and popular science magazines. The version most people received was the visual one, an image of a white planet, rather than the biological one, which asked what kind of life persists when the ocean freezes. The hypothesis was neither fully confirmed nor abandoned in the years following Hoffman and Schrag's paper. Evidence accumulated on both sides. The debate produced a large technical literature, and by the 2010s, a broad if not universal consensus that the Cryogenian glaciations were more extensive than any other in Earth's history, though the question of whether coverage was complete or partial remained open. But the detail that neither the snowball nor the slushball model fully resolves is what happened to the ocean underneath the ice. Sunlight could not penetrate solid ice more than a few meters thick. The deep ocean, cut off from photosynthesis at the surface, would have run on chemical energy alone, hydrothermal vents, chemosynthesis, a slow cycling of heat and mineral-laden water and darkness. The organisms that survived there, if any survived there, would have been the ancestors of everything alive today. Every fish, every whale, every coral reef, every cyanobacterium in the modern sunlit ocean would descend from something that lived through a period when the ocean's surface was sealed by ice and the only warmth available came from below the seafloor. That lineage persisted. We do not know for how long, we do not know in what form, we know only that it did because we are here. Number 1, the Hadean Ocean. It formed under conditions that, by any reasonable measure, should have made it uninhabitable, and there is growing evidence that something lived in it anyway. 4.4 billion years ago, the Earth was 40 million years old. The The solar system was still crowded with debris, remnant planetesimals, captured asteroids, objects that had not yet been swept into the growing planets or ejected from the system. The period from 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago is called the Late Heavy Bombardment, and the record it left on the Moon, the highland craters visible from Earth on any clear night, implies that the Earth received similar treatment. Impacts sufficient to vaporize surface water entirely, to melt the upper crust, to reset the chemistry of any ocean that had managed to condense. And yet the oldest mineral grains on Earth, zircon crystals from the Jack Hills of Western Australia, dated by uranium lead geochronometry to 4.4 billion years ago, contain a chemical signature that geologists interpret as evidence of liquid water at the surface. Dr. Stephen Modsis of the University of Colorado Boulder, analyzing these crystals in work published in the early 2000s, argued that the oxygen isotope ratios preserved in the zircons indicated that the early crust had interacted with liquid water, that a Hadean Ocean existed not after the bombardment but during it. The ocean was being vaporized and reforming repeatedly across hundreds of millions of years between impacts. Dr. John Valley of the University of Wisconsin-Madison led a team that in 2014 published in Nature Geoscience the most precise age measurement yet obtained for the Jack Hills zircons, 4.4 billion and 400 million years, plus or minus a margin of error small enough to be meaningful. Valley's team also confirmed the low-temperature isotopic signature that Modsis and others had used as evidence for liquid water. They did not claim that life existed in the Hadean Ocean. They claimed only that liquid water did, but the implication was clear to everyone in the field. If liquid water existed, then the window for life to begin was potentially wider than the previous consensus had assumed, not starting at 3.8 billion years ago after the bombardment ended, but extending back into the bombardment itself. The possibility of Hadean life entered public discourse with considerable caution. Science journalists who covered Valley's paper in 2014 were careful to distinguish between evidence for liquid water and evidence for life. Most popular accounts of the Hadean Ocean described it as violent, hostile, and almost certainly sterile, a setting for the planet's origin story rather than a habitat. The version that circulated was not wrong, it was selective. No evidence of Hadean life has been confirmed. The search for it is active. Researchers studying the limits of microbial life, extremophiles that survive in conditions once thought lethal, boiling acid, near vacuum pressure, ionizing radiation, have progressively lowered the floor of what habitable means. Organisms have been found living in water that circulates through the hot rock adjacent to hydrothermal vents at temperatures above the normal boiling point of water, sustained by the pressure of the deep ocean. Organisms have been found in the crystalline structure of rock itself, metabolizing at rates so slow they divide once every 10,000 years. The category of uninhabitable has been narrowing for decades. And yet what no hypothesis about Hadean life can resolve is the timeline. If life began in the Hadean Ocean in the gaps between impacts, in hydrothermal systems insulated from the surface bombardment, in thin films of liquid water on rock that would have been vaporized and reconstituted dozens of times, then life did not begin in a stable, nurturing environment. It began in an ocean that was intermittently a gas. It was interrupted, destroyed at the surface, driven underground, and forced to restart from whatever had survived in the rock below repeatedly, across a period of time longer than the span from the Cambrian explosion to the present. The fact that life exists now does not mean it was inevitable. It means that whatever began in that ocean was interrupted and resumed enough times in enough protected niches, that some lineage survived across 400 million years of bombardment. The Hadean Ocean was not a cradle. It was a furnace that something refused to go out in, and it did so without witnesses, without a record, without any trace except the chemistry of a crystal no larger than a grain of sand, waiting in the rock of an Australian desert for 4 billion years to be found. Every ocean on this list was the entire world. Not a part of the world, not a region, not an ecosystem nested within a larger context, the entire world, for the organisms that lived in it. Each one was destroyed, transformed, or drained and took most of what it had produced with it. The ocean that exists today, the one that covers 70% of the Earth's surface and is treated as a fixed feature of the planet, is younger than the dinosaurs. It is not permanent. It is the current version, and if the record shows anything, it is that the current version always ends. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.